the institution that funds education for eligible students, the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, or NSFAS, remains in the news for the wrong reasons. The NSFAS CEO, Andile Nongogo, has been fired after a report found he participated in choosing companies to disburse funds and there was a conflict of interest. Maladministration led to more than 80,000 students not receiving allowances on time. Well, delays in payments and payments to GO students has been a concern for some time. Senior Research Fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study at UJ, Muller, says the NSFAS crisis reflects a pattern of bad decisions by the state. He joins us now. Mr. Muller, thank you very much. The wrong people are being put in a position of high responsibility. Seems to be the gist of what you're saying. Is Andile Nongogo an example of that?
Thanks, Francis. Yes, I mean, that conclusion is actually broader than just NSFAS and even higher education. But what I was getting at in the NSFAS case is the fact that these problems actually precede the current CEO. They precede the administrator who was appointed before the current CEO. So although they're not identical, but NSFAS has had problems over a number of years under different kinds of structures. And none of the senior appointments appear to have resolved those problems adequately, and they haven't put NSFAS on the kind of even keel that one would hope for, especially in a context where the amount of funding for students in higher education has, I think, more than tripled from the previous system after the announcement of so-called free higher education. It's now about 48 billion rand in the current year, which is a sizable amount. And yet, despite that massive increase in allocation, we still have students entering the system who are supposed to be receiving funds, and they're either not receiving them or they're not receiving them when they need to. And that effectively sabotages their attempts at getting an education and undermines the purpose of the system.
So why is NSFAS fundamentally broken then?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question without having more detailed insight into what's going on in the organization. The one thing we know, so for example, the reason it's back in the news now, as you say, is because of the CEO being dismissed. And that's in a context where the system changed from being a university-centered system, where the money was transferred to the universities that then dispersed it to students and made decisions about which students were eligible and which weren't. And there were problems in that system. Okay, so some of the special investigating unit funds that have been recovered were actually from that era. Now it's moved to a situation where it's supposed to be a more student-centered model. Applications are centralized, and funds are supposed to be dispersed directly to the students. So the reason the CEO has been fired is because of allegations that he improperly appointed service providers for those direct disbursements. But in the preceding era, there were very clearly, and I should say, by the way, I'm working on a project funded by the Council on Higher Education looking at the impact of the free higher education policy. And, you know, so we're dealing with some overlapping issues there. But in the preceding era, it appears that the NSFAS systems were such that allocations were made to students either in a way that wasn't rigorous or in a way that made errors. So money was given to students who shouldn't have received funding, and money wasn't given to students who should have. So, you know, there are various problems that have arisen across different periods and across different structures of NSFAS. It's not just limited to these recent developments.
You say the crisis reflects a pattern of bad decisions by the state. So give us that bigger picture then.
Well, Francis, as I was saying, you know, there were these problems that existed with NSFAS before the administrator was appointed. I think it was Minister Naledi Pandor who appointed the administrator. It's not at all clear that the administrator got the NSFAS systems as working as they were supposed to be. Moreover, he left under a cloud of allegations of improper appointments to various positions in NSFAS. I'm not sure if those have ever been adequately addressed or investigated. And after he left, we then had the appointment of the CEO, and that was part of a set of recommendations of a panel that had been appointed by the minister to make recommendations again to improve NSFAS. And now this CEO has been fired, and the board and the minister have justified that on the basis of an investigation, I think, by Werksman's attorneys, essentially finding that he engaged in misconduct, and there are these specific allegations about appointment of inappropriate service providers. But what that suggests is essentially that the direct managerial leadership of NSFAS over the last 5 years has been people who have not done the job properly. So it's not surprising that we're seeing these negative outcomes. And in fact, and the other concern is that what one doesn't see is potentially the consequences for employees in the organization who are trying to do their jobs and who may even have departed because of this kind of instability and misconduct.
Yeah, which we've seen it at other institutions as well. I mean, so, Doctor, as you explore what has gone wrong, any idea of how to get it right in future?
Well, I mean, it sounds trite, but in some sense, allocating these funds is not as simple as, for example, allocating social grants. I think it is important that we take into account that fact. So it's not simply a straightforward process determining the eligibility of students, especially in a country like South Africa where people can have quite complicated living or family arrangements. So assessing something like household income, which is supposed to really be the core basis for making these allocations, is not straightforward. But so the first thing is determining which students are eligible. And the second is then, once that's been decided, making the disbursements properly. I think that the disbursements should be the easier part of the process, and that's where they've currently run into trouble. So what needs to happen is in some sense straightforward. You need to appoint competent and principled people into the top positions. They need to stabilize the organization, make sure that similarly competent and principled people are working within it, stay within it, or attract those people in, and then make sure proper procedures are followed and that the outcomes are achieved. That's what needs to happen. And it sounds trite, but that isn't what's been happening for the last 5 years. And of course, as I was saying, there are other institutions, including universities, where we see similar problems in terms of key appointments not doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean, we could start talking about UNISA and a whole host of institutions, but let's leave it there. Thank you very much, Dr. Muller from the University of Johannesburg.